The first shovelful of earth came out of the hillside on September 14, 1873, and that's when the talking started. Helena Novak had arrived in Custer County, Nebraska 3 weeks earlier with a wagon, 2 oxen, a milk cow, and enough determination to make the other homesteaders nervous. She wasn't building up, she was digging down. By the time she'd carved 6 feet into the south-facing slope, her nearest neighbor, a man named Garrett Fulton, who'd survived to Dakota winters, had seen enough. He rode over on a Thursday afternoon and found her waist-deep in prairie soil, her skirts tied up with rope, sweat darkening the back of her cotton shirt. "Ma'am," he said, "you're making a grave, not a home." Helena didn't stop digging. "If I wanted your opinion on where to sleep, Mr. Fulton, I'd have asked before I bought the land." She threw another shovelful onto the growing pile behind her. "But since you rode all this way, you might want to watch how a bohemian woman prepares for winter. You'll learn something." 3 months later, when the temperature dropped to 41 below zero and the wind came screaming across the plains, like nothing Garrett Fulton had ever heard, he'd remember those words. He'd remember them while he watched his woodpile disappear under 8 feet of snow and his last armload of dry kindling turned to ice-crusted kindling that wouldn't catch fire no matter how much kerosene he used. Helena was 42 years old that autumn, a widow of 16 months. Her husband had died of cholera on the trail west from Iowa, buried somewhere along the Little Blue River in a grave she'd never see again. They planned to homestead together, 160 acres. Under the new law, build something permanent. Maybe start over after losing their first farm to debt back in Cedar Rapids. Now she was doing it alone. She'd spend her first week in Nebraska, living in the wagon, studying the land, walking every acre of her claim. The quarter section she'd filed on set where the rolling prairie started its long climb toward the sand hills, a landscape that stretched away in waves of grass that turned gold in September and white by November. There was a creek that ran year-round in the northwest corner, a stand of cottonwoods along the water, and this south-facing slope that caught the morning sun and blocked the north wind. That's where she'd build, not on top of the hill where everyone else put their sodas into it. She'd grown up in a village outside Tabor where her grandfather had kept root vegetables in an underground cellar that stayed cool in summer and didn't freeze in winter. She'd watched her mother preserve food in that space for 20 years without losing a single jar too. Temperature swings. The principle was simple. Earth held its temperature, buffered against the extremes. Go down far enough and you'd find ground that stayed around 50 year-round, warmer than winter air, cooler than summer, but more than that, she understood something else. Something she learned watching prairie fires race across the landscape that first week. Fire needed 3 things: fuel, heat, and air. Take away anyone and it died. Wood stored underground in the right conditions wouldn't dry out in summer wind or get soaked by rain. It would season slowly, stay stable, and if she designed it right, she could keep her fuel supply protected beneath the very floor she walked on. The neighbors started showing up in pairs by late September. First came Tobias and Ruth Kemper, who'd homesteaded for miles east in 1871. They lost their first sod house to a prairie fire and built the second one with a fire break plowed around it. Tobias was methodical, careful, the kind of man who checked his wagon axles twice before every trip to town. He watched Helena dig for about 10 minutes before speaking. "Mrs. Novak, I've built 3 structures in Nebraska territory. What you're doing there, that's not how you survive out here." He pointed at the excavation. "That hole floods come spring. All this nice dry earth you're carving into, it'll be mud soup from March through May and the walls will collapse. I've seen it happen to root cellars that weren't braced proper." Helena paused, leaned on her shovel. "Mr. Keir, how deep did those cellars go?" "Maybe 5, 6 feet." "And how did they brace the ceiling?" Tobias frowned. "Cottonwood logs mostly. Sometimes railroad ties if you could afford them." "Railroad ties soak up water," Helena said. "Cottonwood rots and 3 years underground. I'm using oak beams I brought from Iowa. They'll outlast both of us." She drove the shovel back into the earth. "And I'm not digging a cellar. I'm building a house with a cellar built into it, big difference, by October. When the excavation was 12 feet deep and 24 feet long, the skepticism had taken on a harder edge. Marcus Doyle rode over with his son-in-law, a former Army corporal named James Pritchard, who'd served at Fort Kearny before mustering out. Pritchard had opinions about everything and the voice to share them. He stood at the edge of hell and is pit and shook his head. This is the most full-headed thing I've seen since a private tried to ford the Platte flood. You're building a tomb, lady. First hard freeze. That earth's going to contract and crack every support. You've got, then the whole thing comes down on your head. He spat tobacco juice toward the excavation. I've seen soldiers die in collapsed trenches. It ain't pretty. Helena was inside the dugout, setting the first of her oak support posts into holes she'd augmented with creek stones for drainage. She didn't climb out to answer him, Mr. Pritchard. Did those trenches have proper drainage channels? Did they have support posts set every 6 feet on centers? Did they use horizontal bracing with cross members? Silence from above. That's what I thought. Helena said, you're thinking about military field fortifications. I'm building a house that'll be here in 50 years. Different engineering. She tamped earth round the post base. But I appreciate your concern. Makes me feel like part of the community. The design was more complex than anyone realized from watching her dig. The main living space measured 20 by 14 feet, carved into the hillside with the front wall set back 4 feet from the slope face. That front wall would be sod blocks 2 feet thick with a door and one south-facing window. The rear wall was pure earth cut smooth and faced with thin boards she'd scavenged from an abandoned claim 8 miles north. The roof would be log beams covered with willow branches, then tar paper, then 18 in of sod. Standard dugout construction, the kind you could find scattered across Nebraska by the thousands. But beneath the floor, that's where her real innovation lived. She dug an additional 4 feet down along the entire western edge of the main room, creating a chamber 8 feet wide and 20 feet long. This was her firewood vault. The entrance was a trap door set flush with the main floor, accessible but out of the way. The walls were lined with stones from the creek bed, mortared with clay mixed with grass. The floor was pitched slightly toward a drainage channel that led outside through a clay pipe, gravity-fed, emptying 30 feet down slope where the water couldn't run back. The ceiling of the vault was the same oak beams that supported her floor above, but she'd notched them to allow air circulation. Not much, just enough to prevent moisture accumulation without creating a draft that would pull heat. The firewood would be stacked on rock platforms raised 6 in off the floor. Any water that somehow made it in would drain away before it touched the wood, and the temperature down there would stay stable, cool enough that the wood wouldn't dry out too fast and crack, warm enough that it wouldn't grow mold or mildew. She'd done the mathematics in a ledger book by lantern light, sitting in her wagon on cold September nights. Nebraska burned through approximately 1 cord of wood per month during a typical winter. A cord measured 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, 8 feet long, 128 cub feet. Her vault could hold 6 cords comfortably with room to access each stack. That was enough. Fuel to last from October through March with reserve. She'd cut most of it from the cottonwoods along her creek, dead timber that had fallen during the last few years. The rest she'd bought from a man in Broken Bow who hauled loads down from the Niobrara River country. It had cost her $40, nearly a quarter of her remaining cash. But drywood in January was worth more than gold. She'd learned that watching her neighbors during her first weeks on the claim. Every homesteader had a wood pile, most kept it outside, covered with canvas or spare boards. Some built small sheds. But when wind hit 40 miles per hour, and it did that at least once a week out here, those covers tore loose. Snow buried the piles, ice glazed every log. By February, people were burning furniture because they couldn't keep their outdoor wood dry enough. Too late. The first snow came on November 2nd, 6 in overnight. Helena had moved into the dugout for days earlier, even though the interior walls weren't finished. And she was still sleeping on the floor in her bedroll. The door was hung. The window had real glass she'd hauled from Omaha, and the stove was installed a small cast iron model that burned hot and efficient. She chinked the saw walls with clay mixed with prairie grass, filling every gap she could find. The roof didn't leak. The floor stayed dry. And when she lifted the trap door to her firewood vault and climbed down with a lantern, the air smelled like earth and oak and possibility. The wood was exactly as she'd stacked it, bone dry, organized by size. She brought up an arm load and had a fire going within 5 minutes. The stove heated the small space to 68 while outside the thermometer read 24. She used 3 logs that first evening. At that rate, her 6 cords would last 7 months, more than enough. Ruth Keir came to visit on a Sunday in mid-November, bringing fresh bread and what Helena suspected was either sympathy or morbid curiosity. They sat inside the dugout drinking coffee while wind rattled the window. Ruth looked around at the earthen walls, the low ceiling, the compact space. "It's warmer than I expected," she admitted, "and you don't smell must." "Earth breathes," Helena said. "Long as you don't seal it up completely, it regulates itself. Moisture goes out through the sod. Cold stays outside, heat stays in." She poured more coffee. "My grandfather kept vegetables in a cellar like this for 6 months at a time. Potatoes, carrots, beets. They'd come out in April tasting like he'd just pulled them from the ground." Ruth glanced at the trap door. "Tobias says you've got a whole second room down there. Says it's for firewood, 6 cords worth. That seems like a lot of digging just to keep wood dry. Why not build a shed?" "Because sheds blow over," Helena said, "and canvas rips. And when a blizzard drops 3 feet of snow in 6 hours, you can't get to a shed that's 30 feet from your door. But I can get to my wood without putting on a coat." She smiled. "Besides, the digging was free. Lumber costs money. Now, here's what I want you to do. If this story sounds like the kind of practical wisdom that's worth preserving, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We're documenting techniques that kept families alive on the frontier, knowledge that's disappearing faster than the old-timers who remember it. Your subscription helps keep this research going. Thanks for being here. December arrived with temperatures that made November look like spring. On the 8th, the mercury hit 6 at dawn. On the 14th, it dropped to -2. Helena burned through half a cord that week, but every piece of wood she brought up from the vault lit on the first match. Meanwhile, her neighbors were learning the difference between dry kindling and frozen kindling. Garrett Fulton rode past on December 18th, stopped at her door. "Mrs. Novak, I'll pay you $10 for a week's worth of dry wood. I don't have spare." "To sell, Mr. Fulton, $15. Still no, but if you want, I'll show you how to build what I built. Come spring, you can dig your own vault." He looked at her for a long moment. "Spring's a long way off when you're burning green wood that smokes more than it heats. Then I guess you'll have plenty of time to think about engineering." Helena said she wasn't cruel about it, but she wasn't going to deplete her reserves to solve problems that better planning would have prevented. Christmas week brought the kind of cold that made your lungs hurt when you breathed. -18 on Christmas Eve, -23 on Christmas morning. The sun came up pale and distant, doing nothing to warm the air. Helena spent the day inside, baking bread in her stove, reading a book she'd carried from Iowa. Staying comfortable in the steady 65 warmth her dugout maintained, she used for logs that day. Outside, the wind was pulling heat from every above ground structure faster than stoves could replace it. Families huddled together under blankets. Children slept in their clothes. Men went outside to their wood piles and found solid blocks of ice that required an axe to separate. Some burned furniture, some burned fencing. Some seriously considered burning the walls of their own sheds just to stay warm enough to survive. Until morning, Marcus Doyle lost 3 fingers to frostbite trying to split frozen logs on December 26th. Dr. Patterson rode out from Broken Bow, a 40m trip, and amputated them at the first knuckle. Doyle would live, but he'd never grip an axe the same way again. The blizzard started on January 14th, 1874. Helena was hauling water from the creek when she noticed the sky. It had that yellowish-gray color that meant snow, but worse than that, the air had gone still. Completely still, no wind at all. The temperature was 12 which wasn't terrible by Nebraska standards, but that stillness made her nervous. She'd grown up hearing stories about blizzards that killed people 50 feet from their own front doors. Storms where the snow came so thick and fast you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. She filled both her water buckets, carried them inside, then went back for 2 more. She brought in extra firewood, more than she'd need for a week, and stacked it near the stove. Then she checked her supplies: flour, beans, salt, pork, coffee, dried apples, enough for a month if she was careful. She filled every container she had with water from the buckets. Then she settled into wait. The snow started at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, light at first, just flakes drifting down through that eerie stillness. By 4, it was falling harder. By 5, the wind had arrived, not the steady prairie wind that blew every day. This was something else. This was wind that screamed. Wind that hit the side of her dugout and made the earth shudder. She watched through her window as visibility dropped from 100 yards to 50 to 20 to nothing. By 6 o'clock, she couldn't see the cottonwoods along the creek. By 7, she couldn't see the wood pile she'd left outside, the one she deliberately kept as a decoy stacked with green wood she didn't plan to burn. The thermometer outside her window read 8, then 0. Then it dropped below 0 and kept falling 6-1 to 1-8. The wind must have been hitting 50 miles per hour, maybe 60. It found every tiny gap in her saw walls and whistled through. She stuffed rags in the cracks. The temperature inside her dugout dropped to 58. She added more wood to the stove. 59, 60, 62. It stabilized there, outside. The wind was creating a chill factor that would kill exposed skin in under 5 minutes. Inside, Helena was warm enough to read by lamplight. The storm lasted 41 hours. When it finally stopped on the morning of January 16th, the sun rose on a landscape that looked like another planet. Snow had drifted to heights nobody had seen before. Garrett Fulton's barn was buried to the roofline. The Kears chicken coop had vanished completely, the birds frozen solid inside. Drifts covered fences, wagons, outbuildings. The temperature that morning was minus 34. The wind had died down to maybe 10 miles per hour, but that was enough to keep the chill factor deadly. Helena waited until noon before opening her door. The snow had drifted against the front of her dugout, but because she'd built into the hillside with the entrance recessed, the drift was only about 3 feet deep. She could dig out. She could get to the creek. More importantly, she could breathe. Above-ground structures weren't so lucky. James Pritchard's chimney had frozen solid with ice from condensation. The smoke had backed up into his house, forcing him and his wife to choose between suffocation and freezing. They'd opened a window. The temperature inside their home had dropped to minus 15. They'd survived by climbing into bed together, fully clothed, piling every blanket they owned on top of them and praying they'd wake up. They did, but barely. Ruth Kemper's husband had tried to reach his woodshed during the height of the storm. He tied a rope around his waist, and his wife had held the other end while he worked his way through the drifts. He'd made it 15 feet before the wind knocked him down. Ruth had pulled him back inside using the rope. His face was frostbitten. His fingers were white. She'd saved his life with that rope. But it had been close, too close. Marcus Doyle, still recovering from his amputated fingers, had run out of firewood on the second day of the storm. Not because he didn't have any, because it was buried under 8 feet of snow and he couldn't reach it. He'd burned to chairs, a table, and half his cabin door before his son-in-law had broken through from next door with an armload of wood that was barely dry enough to catch. The Hendrickson family, homesteaders from Sweden, who'd arrived the previous spring, had lost their entire wood supply when their shed collapsed under the snow load. Mother, father, 3 children huddled in their sod house, burning strips of tar paper and dried buffalo chips they'd collected the previous autumn. The buffalo chips burned, but they didn't burn hot. The family spent 2 nights in temperatures that never got above freezing inside their own home. Helena used 9 logs during those 41 hours. Every single piece came up from her vault bone dry, split clean, ready to burn. The stove kept her dugout at a steady 62. She slept normally. She cooked normally. She read her book and drank coffee and never once worried about whether she'd have fuel for tomorrow. When the storm ended and she finally dug her way out into the bright, frozen morning, the first thing she did was check on her neighbors. She found Garrett Fulton standing in front of what used to be his wood pile. It was now a solid mound of snow and ice, 8 feet tall and 12 feet across. He was hitting it with a pickaxe. "How much drywood you got left?" Helena asked. He stopped swinging, looked at her. "None. Haven't had drywood in 3 weeks. Your family warm enough. Warm enough not to die. That's about all I can say." He went back to hitting the ice. "Should have built what you built?" "Yes," Helena said. "You should have." The next week was cleanup and recovery. The temperature stayed below zero until January 23rd. People dug out. They assessed damage. They helped neighbors who'd lost more than they could afford to lose. The Hendricksons moved in with the Kempers temporarily. James Pritchard borrowed wood from 3 different families just to get through to February. And one by one, they came to Helena's dugout. Not to borrow, to learn. Tobias Keir was first. He showed up on January 25th with a notebook and a pencil. "Mrs. Novak, I'd like to see your firewood storage if you're willing to show me." She took him down through the trap door. He spent 20 minutes examining everything. The drainage system, the ventilation notches, the rock platforms, the clay mortaring. He took notes. He asked questions, good questions, specific questions about measurements and materials. The engineering simple, Helena said, but it has to be precise for feet deep minimum for thermal stability, drainage absolutely critical. Ventilation just enough to prevent moisture, not enough to create temperature swings. Tobias nodded, kept writing, "I'm building this come spring exactly like you showed me." "Good," Helena said, "because next winter might be worse." Garrett Fulton came 3 days later. He didn't say much, just asked to see the vault. Helena showed him. He stood there studying the layout, the support posts, the way she'd integrated it beneath her living space. Finally, he spoke. "I was wrong about you. I thought you didn't know what you were doing. Turns out you knew exactly what you were doing and I didn't. Mr. Fulton, you survived winters I haven't. You know things I don't, maybe," he said. "But I don't know this and I should have kept my mouth shut until I understood what you were building." He paused. "I'm sorry." "Apology accepted," Helena said. "Now, are you going to build one? Or are you going to spend next December hitting frozen wood with a pickaxe?" By March, 7 families within a 5 meters radius had started digging, not full dugouts. Most already had homes, but they were excavating firewood vaults using Helena's design, adapting it to their specific situations. Some dug beside their existing sodus, some carved into hillsides like Helena had. One innovative homesteader named Wilhelm Brown built his under the floor of his barn accessible through his workshop. The principle was the same: get the wood underground, keep it dry, maintain access during the worst weather, protect the resource that literally kept you alive. The difference between surviving a Nebraska blizzard and dying in one often came down to simple things: dry kindling versus wet kindling, easy access versus 30 feet through waist-deep snow, planning versus hoping. The following winter, 1874 to 1875, was milder, but the winter after that tested everything they'd learned. January 1876 brought a storm that lasted 6 days. The temperature dropped to -41. Garrett Fulton, with his new firewood vault modeled on Helena's design, stayed warm the entire time. So did Tobias Keir. So did the 5 other families who'd built similar systems. The Hendricksons, who'd chosen not to dig a vault and instead built a stronger shed, lost their wood supply again. Same problem, different year. They made it through, but it was close. By 1877, the word had spread beyond Custer County. Homesteaders in Buffalo County, Dawson County, Valley County. They were hearing about the Bohemian woman who'd built her firewood storage underground and hadn't lost a single log to weather in for winters. Some dismissed it as too much work. Others recognized it for what it was: Elegant engineering that solved the survival problem using nothing but understanding and effort. Helena lived in that dugout for 11 years. In 1884, she married a widower named Robert Talmadge, who had 3 grown sons and a larger homestead 8 miles north. She moved to his place but kept her original claim, leasing it to a young couple from Illinois. They lived in her dugout for 6 years and reported the same thing: stable temperature, dry firewood, minimal fuel waste. The dwelling lasted until 1903, when the new owners finally built a frame house with milled lumber and modern conveniences. They filled in the dugout and planted weed over it. But the principle Helena had demonstrated that smart engineering beats brute force every time. That principle spread across the Great Plains and became part of the collective knowledge that kept thousands of families alive through winters that killed the unprepared. Modern archaeologists studying frontier settlements have found dozens of underground storage chambers near dugout sites across Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas. Most are collapsed now, filled with soil and forgotten. But the engineering they represent, the understanding that Earth maintains thermal stability, that drainage prevents moisture problems, that accessible reserves beat distant stockpiles, that understanding is identical to what engineers use today. In passive cooling systems, root cellars, and geothermal storage, the technology didn't change. The principle didn't change. What changed was that people stopped being desperate enough to dig for feet into the ground just to keep firewood dry. They got furnaces and coal deliveries and eventually natural gas. They didn't need to think about thermal mass and drainage channels, because other people solved those problems for them. But on the frontier in 1873, there was nobody else, just you and the earth and the knowledge you brought with you. Helena Novak brought knowledge from a village in Bohemia, where her grandfather had understood something about underground storage that most American settlers hadn't considered. She adapted it to Nebraska conditions. She built it precisely. And when the crisis came, and it always came, she was ready. The critics who'd questioned her that first autumn, they learned. Some learned fast after the first blizzard. Some took longer. But eventually they all understood that mockery is cheap and survival is expensive. The man who calls you foolish in September might beg to borrow your dry kindling in January. The neighbors who laugh at your dugout might be digging their own by March. That transformation from skepticism to respect to imitation. That's how knowledge spreads on the frontier, not through books or lectures, through survival, through proof, through a 41-hour blizzard at -30 for when the difference between your family living and dying is whether you can start a fire with. The first match, Helena died in 1911 at the age of 80, survived by her second husband, 7 stepchildren, and a reputation as a woman who'd understood engineering before most men in Custer County knew what the word meant. Her obituary in the Broken Bound newspaper mentioned her innovative approach to homestead construction. It didn't mention the firewood vault. That detail was too technical, too specific. But the people who'd lived through those early winters, the ones who'd watched her dig that first hole into the hillside in September 1873, they remembered. They remembered because they'd copied what she built. Because their children stayed warm using her principles. Because in the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival, Helena Novak had done the math correctly and they'd learned from her example. If you found this story valuable, if you appreciate the preservation of practical frontier knowledge that's rapidly disappearing from living memory, consider hitting that like button and sharing this video with someone who values traditional wisdom. These stories aren't just history. They're documentation of engineering principles that worked then and still work now. They're proof that the simplest solutions, when built correctly, often outperform the complex ones, and they're reminders that the person you underestimate today might be the one who saves your life tomorrow. The last time anyone saw physical evidence of Helena's original dugout was in 1957, when a farmer was plowing the old Novak claim and his tractor broke through into a cavity about 4 feet underground. He climbed down with a flashlight and found the remains of the firewood vault, oak posts still standing, rock platform still intact, drainage channels still visible. He took some photographs and showed them to his grandfather, who remembered Helena Talmadge as an old woman who'd come to church in broken bow, even after she could barely walk. The grandfather said she'd been the smartest person he'd ever met, man or woman, educated or not. Said she'd understood things about building and whether the people with engineering degrees couldn't grasp. The farmer filled in the cavity, couldn't leave a hole in his wheat field. But he kept those photographs. His grandson still has them today. Faded black and white images showing oak beams and rock foundations and the evidence of engineering that outlasted most of the wooden structures built during that same period. The dugout is gone. The firewood vault is filled with soil. Helena has been dead for more than a century. But the principle she demonstrated, that preparation beats desperation, that knowledge weighs nothing and costs only effort to acquire, that the skeptics are often wrong and the quiet innovators are often right, that principle doesn't age. It doesn't decay. It's as valid in 2024 as it was in 1874. The technology changes. The tools improve, but the fundamental truth remains. When you're facing a Nebraska blizzard at -41, the person who prepared correctly survives. The person who mocked that preparation freezes. And the person who learns from watching that difference, they become the innovator for the next generation. Helena Novak dug a hole in the ground and kept her firewood dry. Her neighbors laughed until they didn't. Then they copied what she'd built. Then they taught their children to do the same. That's how wisdom survives. Not through preservation, through use, through proof. Through the brutal, honest testing that winter provides to everyone equally. Regardless of pride or prejudice or preconception, you can build it right or you can build it wrong, but the blizzard doesn't care which you chose, it only reveals which choice you made.